Okay, so welcome back to the channel. To anyone listening in, today's guest is, I believe it's pronounced Manfred Svensson, right? Who I believe you're a professor of philosophy
That's
in,
right, yeah.
right, in Chile. And today we're going to be going through a topic that I find very interesting, and it's something that we've kind of been having a sort of renaissance of, which is the Aristotelian tradition in early modern Protestantism, right? So first, could you tell us about who you are and maybe why you decided to write on this topic?
Sure. Well, nice to be with you, Edwin. Thanks for the invitation. I'm a professor of philosophy, as you mentioned, at the University of the Andes in Santiago, in Chile. So the university is literally in the Andes. This is a relatively young university, 30 something years. And I've been working here at the philosophy department since 2007, teaching mainly medieval philosophy for the first 15 years, and then increasingly history of political philosophy. So broadly these two fields, medieval and political, moral, or generally practical philosophy. So that's my teaching. And then in terms of research, I've been broadly concerned with two areas. One is problems of continuity, discontinuity between Reformation and the earlier Christian intellectual tradition. This, of course, connects with my teaching of medieval philosophy, and then in the case of political philosophy, I've worked mainly on the history of the concept of toleration. This relates less directly to this book, but it's an area where I also done some work related to some Protestant scholastics, especially John Owen, his writings on toleration in relation to John Locke. But yeah, this book, the Aristotelian tradition in early modern Protestantism, in some way connects these two broad fields where I've been teaching and doing research. How did I end up writing this? As usual, I wanted to read a book like this, and nobody had written it, or last time someone tried to write it was a bit more than 100 years ago. Peterson, 1920, I think. But he wrote a book concerned not with Protestant Aristotelianism in the field of practical philosophy alone, but his book was in one sense concerned with a broader field, with the whole of Aristotle's reception, and in another sense it was a narrower book because it was limited to the German reception. I think he mentions in his foreword that he started with broader concerns that would have included Aristotle's reception beyond Germany, but of course the war made this impossible. So yeah, so work limited to Melanchthon, Camerarius, a few other German commentators. But then it's also the case that we have access to so much more now in terms of digitalized works. So even for the case of Germany, the number of commentaries that I was able to find and discuss here is significantly beyond the ones covered by this book written a century ago. And yeah, perhaps that's fine as a first introduction. And of course, this is also connected to the fact that today we are in the midst of a broader movement of ressourcement, which has naturally focused on classical Protestant theology, not on the philosophical works of the period. And I guess everybody who's involved in this ressourcement is aware of the fact that this theological tradition, Protestant orthodoxy, Protestant scholasticism, has a significant philosophical component, and there is significant work being done in some aspects of this philosophical side of Protestant scholastic theology. But yeah, I guess I was interested in looking more exclusively at this side, which had not received the attention it deserves.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I thought that was really important because, yeah, I agree. I've been seeing the ressourcement movement, and a lot of people, the focus is on theology, which is great, but not as much on politics, ethics, metaphysics, physics, logic. All these things are kind of being a little bit ignored by most people. So I thought your book was a good insight into how those things are important too. And I wanted to open up with a quotation that I noticed you also were already familiar with in the introduction from Charles Schmidt. I read his Aristotle and the Renaissance a while back, and I'll just open up with something that he says, where he goes, after the Reformation began in 1517, the philosophy of Aristotle was adopted um, in varying forms, though scarcely in varying degrees, by essentially all segments of the newly fragmented European Christianity. It is important to underline this point in order to refute the common misconception that post Reformation Aristotelianism was largely confined to the areas of Catholic religion. Indeed, I think that one can almost say that from 1550 to 1650, the tradition was stronger among the Protestants than among Catholics. It seems almost perverse to insist on this, but looking at the facts, one cannot do otherwise. So there's been some more accurate understanding about the relationship between Protestantism and Aristotle. Even in the past, like you noted, some of the scholarship um, has not gone maybe to the extent that you have, but they've noted it in passing. So could you tell us more about this relationship, since the average layman, I feel, doesn't is not aware of this. They view this relationship as one of hostility, as if the very movement of the Reformation is to move away from Aristotle. So what do you have to say about that
Yeah,
narrative?
it's a great quote. That's a book from 1983. So that's 40 years ago. So it's interesting to note that a scholar of Schmidt's stature was so aware of the importance and scope of this movement. But of course, he was a Renaissance scholar, not a historian of the Reformation, and that's perhaps a good point where we can start looking at this, because I'm not sure you can find any historian of the Reformation 40 years ago with such a clear grasp of this fact. So one thing this indicates is that awareness of this kind of facts varies a lot depending on the field in which you're doing your reading. So things that can sound quite strange if you're reading only within one field, say Reformation history, do not sound strange at all if you work, say, in Renaissance studies, and among historians of the Renaissance, I would say Schmidt is in no way an exception. Everybody, or close to everybody, is aware of the significance of Protestant Aristotelianism. But since it is not a field specially concerned with confessional differences, nobody studies it in terms of a Protestant tradition. So there is awareness of the fact that Protestants commented on Aristotle, but no special focus on the fact that some of these commentators understood themselves as being part of this specific tradition of commentary, even though they took part of a broader Aristotelian movement. So that's one thing we could note to begin with. Then, of course, although perhaps no historian of the Reformation was aware of this in 1983, or at least not in such emphatic terms, more of them are aware of this fact now. I would say you would have to ignore a rather significant amount of scholarship to remain ignorant of this. Some do manage to remain ignorant, but I guess we've made significant progress over the last decades in this regard. What great obstacle did we have to remove in order to do this progress? I would say, well, to a significant degree, the reading of the Reformation with Luther alone, and his criticism of Aristotle at the center of the tradition. Because this is no invention of, say, Catholic anti-Protestant propaganda that Luther was a critic of Aristotle. This is a fact. One can discuss details of this fact, how we should understand his criticism, how far into his mature career he remained a critic of Aristotle, etc. Okay, one can discuss this, but he has some pretty harsh statements, and especially concerning Aristotle's ethics. So this book of mine deals with the field where Protestant reception should perhaps be seen as strangest, because this is precisely the work that Luther described as the worst enemy of grace. Okay, so if this were at the heart of the Reformation, and everybody had followed Luther in this regard, I wouldn't have written this book. But the point is, these statements of Luther, which we often quote as very significant and as representing a shift with the previous intellectual tradition, and thus signaling a break with virtue ethics, natural law thinking, etc., etc. Nobody cared about this in the 16th and 17th century. I'm exaggerating a bit, but only a bit. Almost nobody cared. And above all, teachers of ethics in Protestant universities didn't care. They had to teach ethics because that's their job description, and the statutes of their universities tell them to teach ethics with Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics, or perhaps also with Cicero's On Duties and a few other works. So this is how you teach ethics, and this is not a reaction of Luther after Luther leaves the scene. This is how things work from the beginning, also in Wittenberg. So next to Luther's classroom, Melanchthon is teaching ethics, and he's teaching with Aristotle, and Luther knows this, and elsewhere people are doing the same thing. So so the first thing we must note is that these statements, these so often quoted statements by Luther, are real, but they are they should not be seen as the norm for understanding Reformation approaches to ethics. Or let's put it this way: it's not that Luther is the norm and Melanchthon is the exception, but rather the other way around. So Luther is the exception, and or these statements of Luther are exceptional, and what Melanchthon is doing is the norm, and a very significant norm. So once you notice this, and you start looking at the different universities, you will see commentaries on Aristotle's ethics flourishing everywhere. Strasbourg, Helmstedt, Oxford later, Zurich, etc. So the point is, this is really a massive tradition, a tradition that is quite evenly spread throughout time. I think between 1529 and 1670, you never see 10 years go by without a new commentary being published on the ethics, and in some cases you have numerous editions of these works, which is also relevant because it shows this is not just a type of literature for scholars alone, but presumably significant teaching material, which is edited once and again. So it's evenly spread throughout time, throughout space. Wherever you have Protestant teaching institutions, you will likely find commentaries, or sometimes not commentaries, but a series of disputations on the ethics. But in any case, ethical literature inspired by Aristotle or dealing with Aristotle's text. And it is also confessionally distributed in quite even terms. What do I mean with this? You have a very strong Lutheran and Reformed tradition of commentary. Slightly more significant in the Lutheran case, yes, but for institutional reasons, I would say. So the obvious explanation for this is, well, you have more Lutheran universities. And then I could perhaps mention one more fact, that the number of commentaries I cover in the book. It's hard to say, or sometimes it's hard to say which works we should consider commentaries and which are something close to a commentary. So I give a number around 50 for the ethics. There are some debatable cases, and around 15 for Aristotle's politics. In a few cases, you have the same commentator working on both works, but not necessarily.
Yeah, I've seen that to be the case. Also, with there's a similar situation with Aquinas' Summa. There's another book, Sumiste, but it's on commentary tradition on that, and there's a similar issue of like discerning what is and is not a commentary. Sometimes it's easy to tell, sometimes it's not as
Yeah.
easy. But also how there's a significant place that Aristotle has in his own way on the early church. Typically people associate early church with Platonism or Stoicism, but Aristotle has his places as well. And you note, I think Mark Edwards is his name, who writes on it. But more people often associate Aristotle and Christianity with medieval universities. It's a medieval thing. So before we even get more into Protestant commentators, could you give us some of the medieval background to Aristotelian commentaries?
Sure. Okay, so the perhaps the basic starting point is that Aristotle's works were lost, let's say, for the West for a long period, and we often say that that Aristotle came back to Europe through his Muslim reception and commentary, especially Averroes, and of course there is much truth to this. A significant part of his reception is mediated through Muslim commentators. So middle of the 12th century, we start with this process. Middle of the 13th century, we already have Aristotle's complete works translated from the Greek into Latin. But of course, this means that the fact that we have translations from Greek into Latin means we're not only in touch with his Muslim reception, but also with a Christian tradition of commentary, and this was a surprise for me. I expected to find more references to Averroes and other Muslim commentators in these Protestant commentaries, but though you find a few references, the Byzantine commentaries were actually more significant. So you have a 13th century Latin reception of the Byzantine commentators. So in the process of translating Aristotle into Latin, these commentators, especially on the ethics, were translated as well. And then in the 16th century, you have a renewed reception of these Byzantine commentators. So we should not think of the Protestant commentators as only relying on the well-known 13th century Latin commentators, Aquinas, Albert the Great, etc. They do, or some of them do know these great scholastic Latin scholastic commentators, but they also have access to new translations of the Byzantine commentaries. So someone like Peter Martyr Vermigli, for instance, writes his commentary on the ethics, or on the first 2-3 books of the ethics, with some knowledge of Aquinas, but with a much more significant presence of Eustratius, for instance. So yeah, that's perhaps the first thing I would say about the presence of medieval commentators. Now, this is in a sense a medieval tradition. Then the Protestant commentators are writing in Latin, and they are continuing a Latin tradition of Aristotelian commentary. But at the same time, we must note that this is a tradition which relies partly on this medieval past, but which also is part of the humanist movement.
Yeah, that's a very important background. And I remember how you talk about Vermiglia as well. I thought that was interesting. But one of the first figures I recall you bringing up when you get into Protestant commentators is Philip Melanchthon, like you've mentioned already. So could you talk about Melanchthon's role in this Protestant commentary tradition and what influence he may or may not have had on later commentators?
Yeah, sure. Okay, this is huge role. Now, it's very interesting to note that Melanchthon is perhaps the only of these commentators who, for a short time, was an anti-Aristotelian. Funny, because we think of him as the archetypical Protestant Aristotelian, and well, in a sense he is, but he's also the only commentator on Aristotle's Ethics and Politics who for a while followed Luther in his rejection of Aristotle for a very short period, 2-3 years. Then you have Melanchthon turning back to classical philosophy, but first only to Cicero. So he teaches on duties, and then towards 1527-28, you find the first references in his letters to his teaching on the Nicomachean ethics, and finally the first Protestant commentary on the ethics, which is Melanchthon's 1529 commentary on books 1 and 2 alone. And very soon you have more commentaries coming out from newly founded Marburg and other places. We can move to other places in a few minutes, but in the case of Melanchthon, it is perhaps interesting to note that these are not very typical commentaries. So his influence on the later tradition is very central, and you will often find references in prologues. So 100 years later, people still recognize the starting point of the Protestant tradition of commentary in Melanchthon, but they are not necessarily following his way of writing a commentary, because later commentators will follow more traditional. Traditional can mean different things, scholastic or Renaissance modes of commentary, while Melanchthon's stand out for his topical approach, which means he finds a number of topics in the ethics which he wants to discuss. This does not mean that he ignores Aristotle's text. He sometimes wrestles with specific textual problems or with Aristotle's understanding of a specific point, but above all, he is using Aristotle as a starting point for reflection on topics of interest, and limited topics of interest in a limited number of books of Aristotle's ethics, because Melanchthon never commented on the whole work. I mentioned earlier Vermigli comments books 1, 2, a part of book 3. Melanchthon comments in this first commentary of his. He comments on book 1 and 2. He later adds books 3 and 5. 5 is on justice. What does this reveal? Well, he does not comment on book 6, which is Aristotle's book on intellectual virtues, for instance. He does not comment on book 10, where Aristotle discusses the primacy of contemplative life. So Melanchthon focuses on those books which seem to have a more direct practical relevance. Not strange. So this is the beginning of the tradition, and Melanchthon has practical concerns which have led him to look at this work. He's not working here simply as a scholar of the Aristotelian tradition, or it's not a mainly textual commentary. It's not equally focused on the whole work, but he's looking at those parts which seem to be useful for the urgent tasks of the beginnings of the Reformation. Now, this is not the case in later commentaries. It's rather exceptional. So I mentioned Vermigli and Melanchthon, and this could give the wrong impression. So just as we should not take Luther's anti-Aristotelianism as a norm, well, we should not look at these partial commentaries as a norm either. And we should not think of these theologians who are commenting on Aristotle's ethics as the norm for later commentary. So actually, of these 50 commentaries, only 4 are written by theologians. You have Vermigli, you have Melanchthon, you have I'm forgetting someone. The guy who wrote the first Protestant homiletics. What's his name?
I think I know who you're referring to, but I forget too.
Okay. We'll remember later. Okay. In any case, these are Reformation theologians, not later figures. And the fourth is Antonius Valleus. So that's already a beginning of the 17th century or the 1620s, which is already a context of Synod of Dort. So Valleus was a member of the Synod there. But these are the only 4 theologians, and then you only have teachers from the arts faculty commenting on the ethics and the politics. Hyperius, Andreas Hyperius. That's the 4th theologian, which I guess nobody thinks of as a commentator of Aristotle's ethics. If you know something about Melanchthon, you know he's an Aristotelian, but people who know about Hyperius don't think of him as an Aristotelian commentator, and he was.
Right. Yes, that's right. It was Hyperius. And yeah, I mean, I had a kind of a side question too about some of the influence that, because this is something I haven't spent much time thinking about, but I am interested in, hopefully I pronounce his name right, but the Italian Giulio Pace, or I think Latinized Julius Pacius, who wrote he published a significant edition of the Organon. And I'm curious if you're aware of any significance that Protestants had on making Aristotle more accessible or doing things similar to what Pacius did, just putting Aristotelian works out there.
So yeah, Pacius. Okay, in terms of pronouncing names, I'm in the dark. If someone can correct us later on the YouTube comments section, we will be thankful. But Pacius published an edition of Aristotle's works in 1597, I think. And what was the Protestant role in the disseminating of Aristotle's works in general and of the ethics in particular? My impression is the following: that it is true that the tradition of Aristotelian commentary is very strong, but there is no strong tradition of Aristotelian translation by Protestants. There are few translations here and there, and some significant ones, or some by significant Protestant humanists. But Catholics actually seem to have done more significant work of translation in the 16th and 17th century. Now, translations are one thing, and editions are another thing. So, if we make that distinction, we would say, okay, there was greater work being done by Catholics in translation, but Protestants play a significant role when we look at editions of Aristotle's complete works. So you have one great edition, which is often referred to as the Erasmus edition, because it has a prologue by Erasmus. But the edition was not Erasmus's. And Erasmus himself mentions who did this, and it was Simon Grinaeus. So this is an important early 16th century edition, reprints, 2-3 reprints. It's often also referred to as the Basel edition. So that's one first example. Grinaeus was professor of Greek in Heidelberg, and then you have so that's the significant early 16th century edition of the works, and then you have the Silburg edition and 1590 edition by Casaubon, and this Casaubon edition is the first edition of Aristotle's works that includes the complete works in both Greek and Latin. And this was done under the request of Pacius by Casaubon. So if you look at this series of editions of the complete works, well, Protestants do play a very significant role.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And I mean, some people, even just learning about this, I think Protestants, of course, often not familiar with some of the history, might think that it seems kind of odd to put such effort into making more editions or making commentaries on a pagan. That's the typical answer that I get. And, Calvin has before then he has an interesting section in the Institutes about, even pagans having these admirable gifts that we can learn from. So Could you then comment just on like why do you think that Protestants at this time in the university or outside of the university, why do they care so much about it? Why do they think there was anything worth benefiting from by writing commentaries on the Nicomachean ethics or the politics?
I guess the main thing is that they didn't find this objection, which some people now find significant. They did not find it significant. Some of them did. So this critique, Aristotle was a pagan, why should we look at his work? It's not that this sort of argument is inexistent in the 16th and 17th century, but it is really rare, because it's just not just a matter of ethics. It's the whole of learning, which in some sense is inherited from or partly inherited from the pagan world. So if you take such objections seriously, it's not just ethics that you're throwing out of the picture. So you find some people raising this objection in the 16th century, but so for instance, you find a controversy around this in beginnings of the history of the university at Helmstedt. So you find people. There's a famous theologian there, Hoffman. I don't remember his name now, but Hoffman connecting with the more radical anti-Aristotelian statements by Luther. He is at the center of a controversy there, but well, he had to leave the university because nobody agreed with this as a general approach to learning, and the general approach is, okay, Aristotle was a pagan, but what does this say about his writings? Is this a quality that translates directly into his writings? Should the writings be described as pagan, or is it possible for a pagan to write things that we would rather describe with other terms like true, or sometimes false? But the point is that's how you judge about people's writings, and this can lead you to become very critical of writings which you find to be full of falsity, but sometimes you read writings by pagan authors and find out they are full of truth as well. So maybe we could use this to describe how much there is of critical distance to Aristotle's text among these commentators, because there are many different possible approaches, and you find degrees of distance, adherence to Aristotle's letter throughout this tradition. You have a few, but very few commentators who explicitly set out to comment, correcting Aristotle wherever it is necessary. So I would say this is a tradition that takes Aristotle very seriously. Of course, if you comment a work, this is a sign of devotion. You comment a work you find worth commenting on, etc. Okay, but still, you can comment with special focus on things that need to be corrected. This is the case with 2-3 commentaries. Vermigli is the first significant example. Okay, and of course, it's not a surprise that theologians will take this approach. That's their work, so fine. Vermigli and Valeus, whom I mentioned before. What form does this take in Vermigli? A very strict form. He ends the discussion of each chapter of each book of the ethics with the explicit question, how does this fit with the teaching of the Christian scriptures? Now, the fact that he raises this question does not mean that the answer to the question will be critical of Aristotle. It means raising this question will sometimes lead to a critical approach to Aristotle. And sometimes his answer will be, well, this fits perfectly. Okay, and Valeus, he's less systematic in this sense. He does not raise the question explicitly at the end of each chapter, but the title of the work is a compendium of Aristotle's ethics corrected in light of Christian truth. So you have this intention stated explicitly at the title page. But it's interesting to note that even though Valeus is a theologian who explicitly sets out to sometimes correct Aristotle in light of the scriptures, he also corrects Aristotle in light of Plato. So you see, the fact that someone is a theologian does not mean he's not a philosopher. Philosophers sometimes correct Aristotle because he says things that do not fit well with scripture, and theologians sometimes correct Aristotle because he says things that don't fit well with reality, and sometimes Plato has grasped reality better than Aristotle. So when do philosophers correct Aristotle within this tradition, or where do you find typically Christian correction of Aristotle being done by philosophers? One example is what we would call man's place in the cosmos, to use Max Scheller's famous title. Because Aristotle, in book 6, Aristotle is discussing the relative value of practical wisdom and theoretical wisdom. And one of his arguments for the superiority of theoretical knowledge is the fact that theoretical knowledge deals with more noble objects, like God, and especially the stars. While practical wisdom deals with a less noble object, humans. I found it very interesting to note how often not only theologians, but also Christian philosophers react to this statement. And there are examples of philosophical commentators who are commenting Aristotle in ways that are very literal, commenting line by line, focusing on a correct understanding of Aristotle's texts and not on a philosophical exploration of the issues he raises. And nevertheless, when they see this statement, they react and say, here Aristotle departs from the teaching of the Christian religion, etc., etc. So what does this teach us? Well, of course, they don't have a critical approach to Aristotle. They find this work valuable, but of course they are reading it as Christians. And as Christians, well, there are many ways to read the work.
Yeah, and you touched a little bit on some things regarding moral philosophy in one of the chapters. I think the 3 topics you picked are the good, the relation between happiness and virtue, and natural law. And so could you explain why you picked these 3 topics, and how did Protestant commentators engage with those topics?
Okay, yeah. Well, I picked these. I had to pick something because the Nicomachean ethics, in a way, covers the whole field of ethics. You have significant reflection on the nature of virtue, on different virtues, on the nature of practical reason, etc., on friendship. Yeah. There are very few topics that we hope to find in a systematic ethics which are absent from the ethics of Aristotle. Moral conscience is absent. That's a typical Christian development. But this is, in a way, a systematic ethics. And actually, this is one of the reasons for focusing on the commentary tradition. It gives you access to works that are dealing with the whole of the subject. But of course, it's hard to summarize how they approach the whole subject. So I selected a few topics for different reasons. The idea of the good is interesting because this is a point where Aristotle criticizes Plato. So when a commentator discusses Nicomachean Ethics 1, Book 1, Chapter 6, he has to take sides. He has to pick Plato or Aristotle, or try to harmonize them, and there are different strategies for harmonization. So that part of Chapter 4, I think, of my book, is when I wrote with this more historical question in mind. How do Protestant commentators work when they have to pick sides? And there is, of course, a medieval tradition of commentary that also had to face this problem. So you already have traditions of siding with Aristotle, of defending Plato, or a very, very small tradition of harmonization. So the surprise here is that the tradition of harmonization, which is minimal among the medieval commentators, is very strong among the Protestants. Then virtue. Virtue is, of course, the central topic of Aristotle's ethics. So that's reason enough to take a look at the way Protestant commentators engage with this topic. But it's also the case that people who look at the Reformation as a break with the previous intellectual tradition often focus on this and tell us that a long tradition, centuries-old tradition of thinking of ethics in terms of the formation of good character disappeared with the Reformation. And, no, wrong. And actually here I don't have anything especially interesting to note. It's simply showing how dedicated these commentators were to the understanding of Aristotle's view of habit formation and its centrality in a well-lived life. Well, I guess that's the refutation of this still common view. And natural law. Here we have another problem, that people too often think of Aristotle as central to the natural law tradition. And that's not very accurate. There is some reflection on natural law in the Nicomachean Ethics, or he doesn't use the expression natural law. He speaks of things that are just by nature, in contrast to things that are right only by convention. So this is a small chapter and a rather obscure passage in Book 5, Chapter 7. And that's everything that Aristotle has to say about natural law, because he doesn't have much to say about law at all. Precisely because virtue is the central piece of his system of ethics. Well, but the Christian tradition of commentary on Aristotle is a tradition that integrates this distinction made by Aristotle with Romans 2, with the much more explicit Stoic tradition of natural law thinking, and thinking about the relation between natural law and eternal law. So, well, what I wanted to look at in this case was how the Protestants integrate these different traditions in their commentary of this chapter. So that was a special focus. Now, Protestants have a further way in which they integrate natural law thinking into their commentaries of Aristotle, because prologues to the Ethics by Protestant commentators very often introduce the problem of the relation between Christianity and moral philosophy through a discussion of the law-gospel distinction. And when they make this distinction, they often explicitly discuss not only the Decalogue, but the moral law in terms of the natural law. So often you find a discussion of natural law in two parts of the commentaries, in the prologues, under the topic of the law-gospel distinction, and then again when they discuss Book 5, Chapter 7. So, is this a natural law tradition? Yes, of course, it is. The fact that they are discussing Aristotle, who is not mainly a natural law thinker, is no objection to seeing these commentators as more strongly natural law thinkers than Aristotle himself was. And then there are differences among the commentators in terms of what kind of natural law thinking they represent, how much space they want to make for thinking about mutability, or how much they want to emphasize the connection between natural law and eternal law, etc.
Yeah, no, that's great stuff, and I found your work on this to be very helpful. I first came across your name, I believe, by interacting with some of I always forget how to pronounce his last name, but David Seitzma.
Yeah.
And I think you guys both are the ones who have contributed to this bibliography of Protestant commentaries.
We are working on a bibliography of Protestant ethical literature during the first 250, say, years of the tradition, covering them not only commentaries, not only philosophical literature, but theological literature as well. So this hopes to be a really comprehensive bibliography of ethical literature, which of course means we won't be ready soon, but sometime.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. I've so far I've only read a little bit of Burgersdijk's smaller work on ethics.
His compendium.
The compendium,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah. But I look forward to, hopefully, I mean, one of the reasons I've been trying to engage more with Latin is because I'd like to contribute as much as I can. And like I said, the emphasis right now is on, if people are translating anything, it's theology. But I like to see more translations on these subjects as well. But
yes, there is so much to be done.
Yeah, there's a lot of work still, and I'm glad that I'm alive in this time. But that's all I have for now. I appreciate the time. I think this is the first time I've seen you be able to talk about the subject on an English platform, because I've seen some interviews in Spanish, but I don't think there's been anything in English, right? So
Mhm.
I wanted to get that out there also for people who only speak English, right?
Mhm.
But thank you for the time.
Thank you very much for the invitation and the great conversation, Edwin.